Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel, and today we are going to be talking about The Amazing Spider-Man and The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which were directed by Marc Webb, starring Andrew Garfield, Emma Stone, and a bunch of other people, and this was the first reboot of the Spider-Man franchise after the disaster that was Spider-Man 3 in a lot of people's eyes. I have reviews up for all three Tobey Maguire movies. If you want to click that link and watch that video, I just reviewed that just last week in anticipation for Spider-Man No Way Home, and a large part of me doing this is because we're going to see a lot of villains from all of these movies in this new film. So we're going to kind of explore, Lizard and Electro, but really I just want to talk about these movies and how I feel about them, because there's a lot of Spider-Man movies and they all have different tones and feels, and there's some things that I love about these two movies, and of course there are things that I absolutely despise. But first, let's start off positive. Let's start off with The Amazing Spider-Man, which came out in 2012, and on a personal connection, this was the last movie that I saw at a midnight screening before it could turn into like the Thursday night previews at 7 o'clock that they do, nowadays. Back then, they used to have midnight screenings and it was glorious, and I got a poster of The Amazing Spider-Man. Me and my brother watched it at midnight, alone. We're out. That's the latest I was out for, so long. That's really the only reason why I was out, that late back when I was that young, and we loved this movie. And so I have a lot of fond memories about this movie. And yes, I picked up different things that, other people have said about how this version of Peter Parker isn't right, or this and this and that, and, this is not my Spider-Man type of things. And honestly, it's a movie. Let's just have fun with it. And what I loved about this movie is that it was a more, serious take on Spider-Man, because, back then I didn't really appreciate the campiness and the very comic booky tone and feel of the original Sam Raimi movies. And now, if you watched my last video, you did see that, I do appreciate that a lot more. But back when this movie first came out, I didn't care about that. I honestly thought it was really goofy and silly and over the top, and I didn't want that. And so having a more serious take, I actually really did enjoy. It was cool seeing the origin story of Spider-Man that's just, taken seriously, that I can actually feel more emotionally connected to this character with, because, as fun as the first half of the Spider-Man movie is, back in 2002, it's really goofy. And the second half of that movie, as I said in my previous review, I love the first half as much as I, now appreciate the goofiness of it now. I still don't like it as much as the first half of this movie. And I know that's kind of different than a lot of people's opinions on it. I really like the origin story and seeing that in this movie. When Uncle Ben dies, you feel the impact of it because it is more dramatic. It's more serious. And yes, that original scene in the last movie, or in the original movie, was still really strong. Not taking anything away from that, but the way that this is taken more seriously, and how Spider-Man's origin of being more of a vigilante at first, I think that is just simply more realistic. And I honestly thought it was, pretty good. I get the fact that, he doesn't feel like Spider-Man at that point, and that's kind of the point. He's doing these terrible things as a vigilante. He's, hunting down, profiling people that look like they could potentially be, the killer of Ben Parker. But that also happened in the original movie. When Peter, saw Uncle Ben, die on the ground, he immediately went to go find the person that killed him, and he tracked him down, and he, saw him in the building, and then he accidentally falls out the window and dies. And so it's just, a brief moment, and from there he's able to be Spider-Man. Well, that doesn't happen with this version of the movie. He gets away fully, and Peter never does find out where he is or who he is, or get that revenge that he so very wanted, because he has a montage of him trying so desperately to find this person, but he never does. And it's the bridge scene in this movie where, the Lizard is first, getting on, first attacking the people on this bridge, throwing cars off the bridge, and, Peter sees this kid in this car that's burning, and he's going to save him. That is where he finally learns the lesson that Ben Parker was trying to tell him this entire time, and that is when he became Spider-Man. It's a true origin story for him, not just, a quick thing, oh, now he's Spider-Man, as great as that was. As much as, some people want this movie to just get right into the Spider-Man stuff, I like the fact that they kind of took their time with it. And like I said, that scene where he's saving the kid, where he's telling the kid to put on this mask because it'll make you brave, and, this kid is now seeing that he's just a dude, he's just a regular guy, it's nothing to be afraid of, and that idea of putting on this suit gives the kid bravery. That is so perfectly Spider-Man, because that's what it is. Spider-Man is a nerdy kid, a dorky kid who doesn't have the confidence of Spider-Man. That's the whole point of the duality between Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and that one scene perfectly portrays this. And do I think that Andrew Garfield is the best Peter Parker? We'll get into that in terms of the negatives. I think he's an okay Peter Parker, but I do kind of agree that honestly he's too handsome and too cool to be a nerdy Peter Parker. That's kind of true. And what's funny is every version of Spider-Man that there is, the Tobey Maguire one, the Andrew Garfield one, and the Tom Holland one, deal with different versions of high school, different generations of high school. And I think when this movie came out, that was sort of more so the generation of of Spider-Man. I think he was still kind of too cool, but he was kind of the outsider, the guy who sat in the back of the classroom and, didn't really talk to anybody, didn't really make any friends. And that was kind of the nerdy outcast in that version of high school with that generation. But my generation is more like the Tom Holland Spider-Man, where, everybody, like even Flash Thompson, he's a nerd. He's not some jock bully. And he was still, the bully of Peter Parker. That is more my version of high school. And of course, you have the Tobey Maguire one where it's, again, the jock bully. And it's just very, cliched high school, cliques and all these different character traits that they all have in those movies. It just feels very older generational. And so this is a nice middle ground between those two. And yes, I agree, or I kind of relate more so to the Tom Holland version of high school. This one is still just some generation's version of being a nerd in high school. So I don't take away from people who do like him as Peter Parker. And the last thing that I absolutely love about this movie is that relationship between Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy, with Emma Stone playing that role. And honestly, I love Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy so much more as a love interest than I did with, Kirsten Dunst as MJ. I love the fact that they, a lot of the things in this movie is very similar to what they did in the past. It's very much a rehash of different beats, of different storylines, different character traits that they have in the Sam Raimi movies. But the biggest difference is definitely Gwen Stacy. I know they were trying to do this whole thing with Peter Parker's parents, and it didn't really work out too well. But the true difference between these movies and the last set of movies is Gwen Stacy, and I love her in this role. I would have loved to see a world where they continued these movies and you have Andrew Garfield and you have, a multiverse version where Emma Stone is playing Spider-Gwen. I don't think that'll ever happen. As much as I want that to happen because I love Emma Stone, that would be amazing to me if they continued these movies somehow. And what I love about this character is that relationship between those two is so cute and so I just love that romance between them in this movie. And I think it's perfectly set up in this film. Whether or not the second one does continue that well is, up for debate, and we'll get to that when I get to the second movie. But in this film on its own, I loved it. But that is where the positives kind of end with this movie. I do think this movie has flaws. I do understand the whole thing with Peter being a vigilante and, kind of being upset about that because Peter, at first, Spider-Man doesn't have kind of a heroic feel to him, and I agree with that, and I kind of agree with Captain Stacy's stance when they have that dinner scene, and, Captain Stacy's saying that he's kind of a menace to New York, and I'm like, honestly, he kind of is. And so in that way, I'm kind of back and forth on whether or not I like the original this one. I think I'm still landing on the side that I like it, but I understand that perspective of how the first half of this movie, you're kind of against Spider-Man, but once, you have that bridge scene, and once he starts, being Spider-Man, being the hero after he saves that kid, that stuff is all, fine and great. But I think the problem with this movie definitely lies within the villain. The Lizard is not the greatest villain, and not because the Lizard couldn't have been a great villain. I think they try to make him empathetic, but everything that they tried to do with this villain was something that we've seen before in the old Sam Raimi movies. He kind of had the split personality that's, the Green Goblin had with Willem Dafoe's character, and he had that same sort of, doctor turned mad scientist experimenting on himself that Doc Ock had. And so it's kind of an amalgamation between those two villains, and it just doesn't do either of those things as well as Willem Dafoe could do the, the two-faced sort of thing, talking to himself in the mirror. The actor in this movie just couldn't, he just wasn't as good at that. In terms of the mad scientist storyline, he wants to turn everybody into lizards in this movie, whereas, Doc Ock had a more personal reason of creating this machine, and he was being manipulated by his arms, and like all those different things are very important character traits. In this one, it just feels like they're taking elements of those past villains and just kind of giving it to this character because they didn't really know what to do with him. And like I said, his plan is kind of goofy if you think about it. His whole plan is to turn everybody in the city of New York into giant lizards. Why? Because lizards are better than humans. I don't know. This is the whole villain storyline in this movie just is not great. And I even think the action in this movie definitely does pale in comparison to the action in the Sam Raimi movies. I think one thing about the action in this movie that does work better is the physics of swinging. Swinging as Spider-Man feels so much fun in this movie, and it felt fun in the Sam Raimi movies, but once you had the effects perfected to a point where it was when this movie came out in 2012, it just was very invigorating. It was very entertaining to see Peter Parker or Spider-Man swinging around New York, but the action sequences didn't have that gritty tension that the Sam Raimi movies had. Even with how goofy those movies are, one of the most intense fights in any Spider-Man movie ever is that end fight with Spider-Man and Green Goblin, or even the train fights, of course, with, Spider-Man and Doc Ock. Those fights are iconic. There's nothing in this movie that gives me that feeling of iconic tension. Even the end fight of Spider-Man 3, as much as that movie is a complete mess of, a bunch of different storylines, the action is still very tense. There is a lot of tension in the direction of this movie, and I think Marc Webb does grow as a better director, especially when it comes to the second one. In terms of the action sequences, they're a little more exciting in that one, and this one, they just kind of feel a little bland. So let's now move on to Amazing Spider-Man 2, because I want to talk about the whole Peter Parker's parents storyline, because yes, it was kind of introduced in this first movie and they kind of marketed like, oh, this is going to be the thing that's so different, but it really was just kind of like a little glimpse into who Peter Parker's parents were. You didn't really find anything new about them besides, oh, they were up to something, and Ben Parker might have, or I don't even know his dad's name. Peter's dad just, apparently made the spiders, and you kind of find that as some revelation in the first movie, and you're like wondering, okay, where are they going to go with it in the second movie? And that is definitely the worst part, or maybe not the worst part of this movie. There's a lot of bad parts of this movie. Amazing Spider-Man 2 is equally, if not even more of a mess than Spider-Man 3 was. This movie is trying to do so many things, and it fails at a lot of them, but there's still one element in this movie that works brilliantly. And I want to talk about the first before we get into the negatives, because there's a lot of negatives to talk about this movie, but it's not, terrible. It has some good elements in it, and definitely the best elements is Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone's chemistry as Peter and Gwen. They are adorable in this film. As much as it is sort of irritating seeing their on again, off again storyline throughout the entire film, it gets a little grating at a certain point, because just like either be together or don't, and just like stop with this whole on again and off again thing. It got a little annoying in this movie, but that doesn't take away to how much I cared about their relationship in this movie. And I love the scene when Peter decides that he's going to move to London with Gwen when she's, trying to go to college. I love that, aspect of Peter Parker, like, I will follow you anywhere you go because you are my future. I love all of that. Their relationship was so heartwarming, and the ending of this movie with Gwen Stacy's death was very impactful, almost to a point where I kind of look at this movie as a negative experience, because I was so excited for this movie. Like I said, I loved the first one when it first came out, and I was very excited for the second one. And right before this movie came out, my brother went up to me and he said, oh, he looked up on, Wikipedia or whatever he looked it up on, and he found out that the Green Goblin kills Gwen Stacy in the comics. And, the trailers were showing that Green Goblin is in this movie. And so even before the movie came out, I began to dread the idea of Gwen Stacy dying, because that would just be heartbreaking and crushing, and it absolutely was. And when it comes to Spider-Man movies, I want to walk out of a Spider-Man movie, feeling invigorated, feeling very excited that I just watched a Spider-Man movie, feeling very upbeat and happy after I see a movie. The ending in this movie is so bleak and dark and sad that it kind of makes me walk out of this movie in a bad mood. It makes me walk out just kind of upset and just kind of gross at the end of this movie. And that's not the feeling that I want to have at the end of a Spider-Man movie. Not to say that Spider-Man movies can't end with a sad ending with somebody dying. That's not to say that at all, because the original one does that. At the end of that movie, Peter definitely has a chance to be with MJ, but he decides, because of his responsibility, that he's going to, just completely friend zone her and just walk away at the end of the movie. That is incredibly sad, because you want their relationship to work. You want him to be together with MJ, but he decides not to, and it's a very sad ending, because you just had the death of, Norman Osborn, and they're at this funeral, and so it definitely has some sad, overtones at the end of this movie, but at the end of the day, the movie was so entertaining and so fun, such great action sequences, that even though it ends on a somber note, you're still in a positive mood. You're still excited that you saw a Spider-Man movie. Even with The Amazing Spider-Man, it kind of does end in a sad note, because you have, Captain Stacy dying at the end of that movie and saying that, he needs to stay away from Gwen Stacy, or else before he dies, that was his last wish, and it kind of ends with the funeral and then breaking up. And then it kind of has that hint that maybe they'll get back together, but that still had a somber ending. Yet I still walked out of the theater in a good mood, because the movie was exciting and it was fun, and I did enjoy that. The problem with this movie is, yes, the ending is sad, and probably the saddest of any endings of any Spider-Man movie, but the rest of the movie just doesn't get you in a good, excited mood to where you're walking out of the theater like, oh yeah, that was great still. There are so many things in this movie that I'm just scratching my head like, what were they thinking? Because there's so much setup for the Sinister Six, and there is a natural way to do a Sinister Six movie. There definitely is, and I think in some ways the first two, Tom Holland movies were kind of going that direction, but now they're doing the multiverse thing to kind of, throw together the Sinister Six even quicker than before. Maybe they're not called the Sinister Six. It might not necessarily be. I don't know. I haven't seen the movie, so who knows if this point that I'm making here is just non-existent, but there is a natural way to do it, and this movie did not feel natural at all. And in terms of the villains of this movie, I just didn't care. The whole thing with Paul Giamatti as RHINO at the beginning of this movie is so campy and so over the top, even more so than I think the Sam Raimi movies. The Sam Raimi movies were still entertaining, were still really funny. This one just felt like a cartoon. It felt straight out of just a weird cartoon character. Paul Giamatti's accent is terrible, and Spider-Man is just allowing him to plow through a bunch of cars through New York City, just killing God knows how many people. But at least his suit looks better, and the swinging looks really fun. That's, again, more positives for this movie. The suit looks so much better than it does. It doesn't look like a basketball in this one, at least. But still, he's like allowing them to all die. But that's whatever. Then you get to Electro, and Electro is just kind of like, why does he look like a Smurf? There are many problems that I have with this movie, and Electro's, performance in this movie, nothing against Jamie Foxx. I think Jamie Foxx is a great pick to play Electro. But how they portrayed him in this movie, kind of being like a Jim Carrey from Batman Forever, that was a mistake. I don't know, that was even more campy. Like, the first one took itself so seriously, and it was more grounded and realistic, whereas this Electro character is a straight-up cartoon again. Although, I do love one scene with Electro, and that's the birth of Electro, when he's in, Times Square, and all the cameras are pointed towards him, and he doesn't know, he's kind of afraid of his own power, and he's kind of learning how to use it more, because for the first time in his entire life, he now has power, and so how is he going to use it? How is he going to react to all this attention? I think that aspect of it, even though it's kind of goofy at the beginning of him being like a Spider-Man super fan, that stuff is super goofy, but this scene still works really well with that type of character traits. It's just the fact that it was just shown in such a goofy way before, but this scene works really well, and Peter's trying to talk him off the edge, trying to tell him to stay calm and trying to get the cops away from him, not, fire anything to escalate the situation. That's what Spider-Man would do. Spider-Man would try to de-escalate the things and try to, calm this guy down, and he remembers his name and all this sort of things, and the action sequence in this one is far superior than anything from the first movie, with, Peter having to use his intelligence and his ingenuity after his web shooters are kind of taken out of commission to save all those people on that, red staircase. That is a very intense and very, very well done action scene in this movie that is superior than anything in the first movie. But then Electro just kind of goes away for a little while, and then you have the whole Green Goblin storyline with Dane DeHaan. And this stuff is just straight up bad, because it has stuff to do with Ben Parker, and you learn this whole storyline that, yes, the big revelation in this movie is the same revelation in the last one with Peter Parker's parents, which is that he developed the webs. He developed the spiders that, gave Peter Parker his powers. But the worst part that you find out in this movie is the fact that if anybody else was bitten by those spiders, because it is I can never remember his name, because it was Peter's dad's DNA that he used to create the spiders, only Peter Parker can become Spider-Man. And that is so not Spider-Man. Spider-Verse does this really well, where he says that anybody can wear the mask. Anybody like Miles Morales can wear the mask. There's so many different variants of Spider-Man in the Marvel Comics, and to take that away from this universe, it kind of sucks. It's just like, it just doesn't leave you with the feeling as an audience member like, oh, I'm watching this hero that I relate to now, but now he's kind of like a chosen one type storyline where, no, he's not like you. He's special. And I don't want Peter Parker to be special because his DNA matches with these spiders and that's why he has these powers. I want him to be special because anybody can be that hero and somebody that you can look up to and kind of aspire to be that type of person. That just kind of taken away from this version of Peter Parker, which is kind of sad. And I know I didn't really like James Franco as Harry Osborn in the last movie. I don't think he's the best actor, but Dane DeHaan, although I do like him as an actor, especially in Chronicle, is terrible in this movie. He honestly reminds me of Bully Maguire in Spider-Man 3 with his haircut and everything, and how whiny he is, and how he just really wants to find Spider-Man to get his blood. Like, who cares about that storyline? It's so bad. And so at this point in the movie, there's nothing that I can latch onto besides the Peter and Gwen storyline. I don't really care about Electro as a villain because he had one really great scene, but he's really campy and goofy, and his costume looks terrible, and he's blue like a Smurf, and I just don't really care about his character. Dane DeHaan is like Bully Maguire times 10. He's just really, really dumb. Like, I hate his character, and so I can't really attach myself to him as a villain. The only thing I can attach myself to is Peter and Gwen, but even that is kind of on again, off again. I'm just like watching this movie not having a good feeling about it because everything's just being yanked in different directions. There's so many subplots and storylines that I just don't care about, and by the time you get to the end of the movie, which, I do love that, final scene with Gwen Stacy dying, I think it's very well done, but I think it could have been so much more effective if the rest of the movie had me, like, pumped that I'm watching a Spider-Man movie, if it was exciting, if the action was, at the level of the Sam Raimi movies. Because even though the action is improved in this movie than it was in The Amazing Spider-Man, it's still not as invigorating as it was with Sam Raimi behind the camera. And so as it stands, the final fight starts, Peter beats, Electro, and Gwen is there, and the whole thing happens, and, like, all that stuff I just really didn't care about because I don't care about Electro as a villain. And then all of a sudden Green Goblin swoops out of nowhere and kills Gwen just because that happens in the comics. And it's such a quick thing. The characters are not developed. There's no great storyline with that. And yes, you do still care about the relationship because that's the only thing in the movie that worked. And so the only thing in the movie that worked leads to the character dying in a very sad way. So now the only thing that you've enjoyed throughout the entire movie leads to you feeling crappy because it's a very tragic ending and nothing else in the movie made you happy about what you were watching. So you just walk out of the movie just feeling icky and gross. And I think that's why I dislike this movie even more than I dislike Spider-Man 3, because Spider-Man 3 is bad, but at least you can find enjoyment in it because of how over the top and goofy it is the entire time. This movie is campy and just over the top in different ways that are not funny. It's just kind of bad. And so this is not even a movie that is so bad that it's fun to watch. It's just kind of a bad movie that you just kind of have to sit through just to see one good scene of Gwen dying and then feel like crap afterwards. And so in terms of No Way Home, I am excited to see what they do with Lizard and Electro. Electro mainly because they have that character redesign and he looks great in this new movie and I'm very excited to see him. Lizard, I know there was that Brazilian trailer where you see the Lizard get punched in the face by nothing, and that kind of hints at the fact that maybe Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield are going to be in this movie. Possibly, probably. I'm very, very excited to see that, but I'm really excited to see what they're going to do with Jamie Foxx's character, bringing back Electro, because again, like I said, he was a good casting choice, but his performance was covered in bad CGI of him being a Smurf and just this and the goofiness of the writing for him just wasn't good. I really hope that they redeem him. In terms of Lizard, I just hope Lizard's a fun force to like call him a dinosaur and to just kind of be the muscle of the group that is fighting Spider-Man. So I don't really know what they're going to do with that character. I don't really care what they're going to do with that character, but mainly Electro. This could be the greatest redeeming arc for a bad comic book villain that there ever was. And if we see Andrew Garfield save MJ as she's falling down, that's, Statue of Liberty thing, that would be incredible. I'm very, very excited to continue possibly with at least the villains of this movie in the new film and possibly with Andrew Garfield. There are some elements of these movies that I do enjoy, mainly Peter and Gwen, and if we're getting some sort of continuation with that at all, I will be happy with that. If not, these two movies are just kind of in its little corner as the Spider-Man trilogy that never was, because they ended up rebooting it once again after how bad the second one was. So those are my thoughts on the Amazing Spider-Man movies. Ups and downs, definitely. Some great, some bad, but that's all movies. That's how everything goes. And so what do you guys think of the Amazing Spider-Man movies? Definitely comment down below if you prefer these movies over the Sam Raimi movies, or vice versa, or why. Tell me why everything. Go back and watch my Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi trilogy review, and I will be talking about and re-reviewing Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home, and possibly maybe doing a video on Spider-Verse if I have time, but probably not. But I do have a review up for that one, so I should have reviews up for everything Spider-Man related, and I will have a spoiler review up for Spider-Man No Way Home very soon. So thanks guys for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see all of those things, and I hope to see you all in my next one.